The phone sat on the kitchen counter where I'd left it that morning, its screen dark and indifferent. I remember the exact time because I'd glanced at it, 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in late September, when I heard the notification chime. Most notifications I ignored these days. After 43 years of life, I'd learned that most sounds were just noise trying to demand my attention, and I'd become very good at pretending I didn't hear them. But this one was different. This one came through as a phone call, not a text or an email or some app trying to sell me something I didn't need. A real phone call. Those had become rare, almost extinct in my world. I was standing at the sink washing dishes, something I did every day at almost the exact same time, maintaining the rhythms that kept me tethered to some semblance of normalcy. The kitchen of my small house in Portland, Oregon had become my world not by choice, but by circumstance and by the slow erosion of reasons to venture beyond it. The cabinets were a pale cream color that I'd never bothered to repaint even after moving in 7 years ago. The countertops were a generic granite laminate that had started to peel at the corners. There was a window above the sink that looked out onto a quiet residential street where nothing much ever happened, and that was precisely the point. I'd chosen this life of deliberate unremarkableness, and it had chosen me in return. The screen lit up with that number. I could see it from where I stood, water still dripping from my hands. The number looked familiar in the way that numbers can look familiar when they're burned into your memory so deeply that they become part of the texture of your consciousness itself. But that wasn't possible. That number couldn't be calling. That number belonged to someone who had been gone for 2 decades, who had been buried in a cemetery 40 miles south of here on a gray afternoon in early spring when the rain wouldn't stop and the sky seemed to weep in sympathy with everyone gathered around a small white casket. My son's name was Marcus. He would have been 37 years old. I let the phone ring. I don't know why exactly. Some instinct, perhaps. Some deep warning system that had learned, over the course of a life that felt like it had been lived in a minor key, that the universe didn't make phone calls without a reason, and the reasons were rarely good. The phone rang 7 times. I counted them because I was frozen there at the sink, my hands growing cold in the air, the dishwater slowly draining and turning gray. On the 8th ring, it went to voicemail. I stood there for another 30 seconds, and then I heard the notification that a message had been left. I didn't check it immediately. Instead, I finished washing the dishes with movements that felt mechanical and deliberate, as if completing this simple task might somehow inoculate me against whatever truth was waiting in that voicemail. I dried my hands on the small brown towel that hung on the oven door. Then I picked up the phone and looked at the missed call. The number stared back at me from the screen, patient and impossible. Before I played the voicemail, I sat down at the kitchen table, a small round thing made of solid oak that I'd bought at an estate sale years ago. The wood had a history of scratches and stains that told the stories of other families, other lives lived out in the rituals of meals and conversations. I knew that looking at those scratches and imagining those stories was a way of avoiding what I was about to do, but I did it anyway because I'd become very good at avoidance. It was a skill I developed over decades, refined through practice and necessity. The voicemail was short, 12 seconds. I played it 3 times before I could fully register what I was hearing. The voice was male, young, familiar in a way that made my chest constrict so tightly I thought I might not be able to draw another breath. There was background noise, voices, something that sounded like traffic. The message was simple, just a few words. Dad? Dad, it's me. I'm alive. I don't know how to explain this, but I need to see you. I'm in Portland. I'm at the Riverside Motel on Highway 30. I'm in room 247. Please come. Please don't call anyone. Just come. Then the line had gone dead, and I was left in my kitchen in the fading September light with a son I had buried 2 decades ago asking me to come to a motel. I sat there for a long time, and I don't know if it was minutes or hours. Time had a strange quality then, stretching out in ways that made no sense. I kept replaying the voicemail, hearing that voice that I could have sworn I'd never hear again. The voice that had changed and grown into manhood while existing only in my memory. A voice that shouldn't have existed at all. When I finally moved, it was slowly, as if my body was learning how to function again for the first time. I picked up the phone and Googled the Riverside Motel. It was exactly where the voicemail said it was. About 20 minutes from my house on Highway 30, heading north toward the Columbia River. It was the kind of motel that had been built in the 1970s and had never quite recovered from that particular era's aesthetic mistakes. The pictures on Google showed a faded exterior, parking spaces painted in lines that were barely visible anymore, a small office with neon signs advertising vacancy. I told myself I wouldn't go. I told myself it was a mistake, a cruel prank, someone playing an elaborate joke on a middle-aged man who'd already suffered enough and who didn't deserve any more pain. I told myself all these things with the conviction of someone who was trying very hard to believe them. But even as I was telling myself these things, I was finding my shoes and putting them on. Even as I was telling myself this was insanity, I was grabbing my jacket and keys. The drive there felt both too long and not long enough. I took Highway 84 north toward the river, past the industrial areas and the neighborhoods that hadn't been gentrified yet, past the small parks and the strip malls and all the other anonymous places that make up the geography of an American city when you're not paying close attention. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that looked like they were designed to make you feel small and insignificant. The Riverside Motel was exactly as ugly as its pictures had suggested. It sat back from the highway with a kind of defeated posture, the way old things sit when they've stopped trying to impress anyone and are just waiting to be forgotten. The neon sign flickered, missing a letter, so it read Riverside Moat with a gap where the L should have been. The parking lot was mostly empty, a handful of cars spread out in the way people park when they're trying to maintain maximum distance from each other. I sat in my car for a long time before I went inside. The engine was off, but the steering wheel was still warm from the afternoon sun. I could see room 247 from where I was sitting, second floor, toward the far end of the building. The curtains were drawn, and there was no way to know if anyone was inside. No way to know if this was real or some elaborate hallucination that my mind had constructed to protect itself from the cumulative weight of loneliness. When I finally got out of the car and started walking toward the stairs, I felt like I was moving through water. Each step required a conscious decision to place one foot in front of the other. My heart was doing something irregular in my chest, a rhythm that seemed designed by someone with no regard for human physiology. I climbed the outdoor stairs slowly, and I could see that room 247 was at the end of the second-floor hallway, the last door before the wall. I stood in front of the door for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds or so. The paint was chipped around the doorframe. There was a small sign indicating it was a non-smoking room, though the air smelled like cigarettes from years of people ignoring that sign. I raised my hand to knock, and I remember noticing that it was shaking. I remember thinking about how I hadn't been nervous about anything in years, how anxiety had been slowly replaced by a kind of numb acceptance of whatever life was going to do to me next. I knocked. 3 short, tentative raps on the door. The person who opened it was my son, but it wasn't my son. He was taller than Marcus had been at 17, taller than Marcus would have been at 37. His face was his mother's face, narrow and angular with eyes that were too large for his head in a way that had always given him an expression of perpetual surprise. But there were differences too, small things that added up to a version of my son that I'd never known existed. A scar along his left eyebrow, hair longer than Marcus had ever worn it, tied back in a loose braid. Hands that looked like they'd done physical work, calloused and weathered in ways that seemed impossible for someone who should have been a ghost. "Hi," he said, and that one word carried more weight than words usually do. "Hi, Dad. I know this is insane. I know you probably think you're dreaming or that you've lost your mind. I promise you haven't. I'm real. I'm really here." I couldn't speak. I'd prepared for many things in my life: the loss of my son, the loss of my marriage, the loss of my career and my social standing and my confidence, but I hadn't prepared for this. Nothing had prepared me for this moment, because this moment shouldn't exist. I stood there in the hallway of a motel that smelled like 30 years of human desperation, looking at my dead son, and I couldn't find a single word that felt adequate to the situation. "Please come in," he said. "Please. I know you're shocked. I'm shocked too, honestly. There's so much I need to explain, and I don't even know where to start. Just ... come inside. Don't let anyone see you standing out here. I've already drawn the curtains as much as I can." I moved because he asked me to, because my body was following instructions that came from somewhere other than my conscious mind. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a motel that charged $95 a night. Double bed with a faded comforter. Small television on a stand. Bathroom visible through an open door. Pale yellow walls that might have been white when the room was originally decorated. A single window with heavy curtains pulled almost completely shut, leaving only a thin sliver of the dying daylight. "Sit down," Marcus said, and I sat on the edge of the bed without removing my jacket. He sat in the small chair next to the window, maintaining a distance between us that felt both careful and necessary. "I know you have a million questions. The biggest one is probably how this is possible. How I'm alive when I've been dead for 20 years. I remember the funeral. I remember that clearly, with the kind of crystalline detail that only terrible things achieve in memory. Marcus had been driving too fast on a rain-slicked road in March, the kind of reckless speed that 17-year-old boys sometimes drive when they feel invincible and immortal. He'd crashed into a bridge support on Interstate 5, and the impact had been catastrophic. There had been no survivors, they told us. No possible survivors. I'd identified the body myself. They'd warned me that it might be difficult, that decomposition had already begun, but I'd insisted. I needed to see my son with my own eyes to make it real, to make it the kind of real that you can't recover from. The body in the autopsy room had been covered with a white sheet, and when they pulled it back, I could barely recognize the remains as human. The face was destroyed, shattered beyond recognition, but there were other identifying factors. A birthmark on the left shoulder that Marcus had been born with. A scar on his right hand from when he'd reached into a trash can looking for something he'd thrown away in anger and had gotten cut on broken glass. Dental records that matched. DNA that came back as a perfect match to my blood. There had been no doubt Marcus had been dead. "After the accident," he said, and his voice was quiet, careful, like he was trying to explain something he knew would sound impossible. "I wasn't actually in the car when it hit the bridge. I know how that sounds. I know there's no way that makes any sense, but I need you to just listen. Don't interrupt. Just listen, and then you can ask me anything you want." He stood up and walked to the window, keeping the curtains pulled but looking out through the narrow gap at the parking lot below. I realized he was checking to make sure we were safe, that no one had followed me, that no one was watching. The paranoia in that small gesture told me something important. Whatever had happened 20 years ago, it had consequences that were still unfolding. "I was angry that day," Marcus continued. "I was angry at you, angry at Mom, angry at the world. I just had a massive fight with Amanda, my girlfriend at the time, and I'd just gotten grounded for something stupid. I was 16, and I felt like my life was ending because I couldn't go to some party on Saturday night. I remember I left the house and I was going to meet some friends, and I'd borrowed your car without asking. Do you remember that?" "The Civic," I said, my voice coming out hoarse and uncertain. "You took my Honda Civic, right? I was driving too fast and I was angry, and I wasn't paying attention. But here's the part that no one ever found out. I didn't crash alone. There was someone else in the car with me. His name was Tyler Reeves. He was my best friend at the time. Do you remember Tyler? I did remember Tyler. I remembered him coming to the house to pick up Marcus. Remembered a teenage boy with bleached blonde hair and a kind of reckless energy that made me nervous every time Marcus went anywhere with him. They were always together those last few months of Marcus's life. Tyler had disappeared after the accident. I'd heard that he'd moved away, that his family had relocated to California or Arizona or somewhere far from the reminders of that terrible day. Tyler was in the car with me, Marcus said. He was in the front passenger seat. When I hit the bridge support, we both went through the windshield. The car was completely destroyed. The police found 2 bodies. They brought in dental records and other identification, and they determined that both of us were in the vehicle. They said that we were both killed on impact. But you weren't, I said. I woke up in a hospital in Seattle, Marcus said. I don't know how much time had passed. I learned later it was about 3 days. The first thing I felt was pain. Every single part of my body was broken or torn or fractured. I had internal bleeding. I had a collapsed lung. I had a traumatic brain injury that left me partially paralyzed on my left side for months. But I was alive, and the hospital staff told me that it was a miracle. That's what they kept saying, a miracle. Like God had reached down and decided I was worth saving. He turned from the window and looked at me directly. But here's the thing they didn't understand. Here's the part that only came out slowly as I started to recover. When I first woke up, I was confused. I didn't know who I was. I was in and out of consciousness for days. The medical team kept telling me who I was, kept telling me my name and where I was from, but I didn't actually remember any of it. I don't know if the brain injury did something or if it was the trauma, but I had almost complete amnesia. They kept saying it would come back, that with time the memories would return. Did they? I asked. Did the memories come back? Eventually, yes. Some of them. But by the time they did, something else had happened. There was a detective who came to see me in the hospital, and he showed me a photograph. He asked me if I knew who this person was, and I said no. He told me it was my friend Tyler Reeves. He told me that they'd identified one body as Tyler, but the second body was too damaged for them to make a visual identification. They'd used dental records and DNA to determine that it was me. But in their rush, in their assumption, they'd made an error. The body they thought was me was actually another victim from a separate accident that had occurred on that same stretch of highway on that same day. It took them 3 weeks to realize their mistake. The room seemed to spin around me. I was sitting on the edge of a motel bed, listening to my son explain how he'd been dead for 3 weeks while everyone who knew him mourned and buried someone else. I was trying to comprehend how this could have happened, how there could have been such a catastrophic administrative failure, how I could have identified a body in an autopsy room and been confidently assured that it was my son. Your mother, I said slowly. She was the one who identified you first. The formal identification. I know, Marcus said quietly. That's one of the reasons I stayed dead for 20 years. That's one of the reasons I couldn't come back. When I finally had enough of my memories back that I understood what had happened, when I understood that they'd buried someone else in my grave, I was terrified. Not just for me, but for everyone. I was paralyzed for a long time. I couldn't move my left leg at all. I had permanent nerve damage. The doctor said I might never walk normally again. They said I should prepare myself for a life of disability and dependence. He walked across the small room and sat back down in the chair by the window. Up close, I could see that he did have Marcus's face, even with all the ways it had changed and aged and become something else. When I finally started to recover enough to think clearly, the first thing I did was try to find out what had happened. There was a detective named Patricia Morris who was assigned to my case, and she helped me understand the scope of the mistake. She was the one who realized that the identification had been wrong, that the person in my grave wasn't me. She was the one who had to tell my family, my parents, that there had been an error. But no one ever told me, I said. They never said anything about a mistake. Your funeral happened. We buried you. We had a service. Everything was finalized. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That's where it gets complicated, he said finally. That's where my story intersects with yours in ways that I'm still trying to fully understand. The investigation into the identification error took time. Weeks, months. Patricia Morris was conducting an informal inquiry into how such a massive mistake could have been made. She was looking at the paperwork, the procedures, the chain of custody for the evidence. And in doing that, she discovered something else. He paused, and I could see the effort it was taking him to continue, the way the words seemed to be weighing heavily on his chest. There was someone in authority who had an interest in the mistake not being corrected. Someone who wanted to keep the identification error in place. Someone who wanted me to stay dead. The room felt colder suddenly, even though the temperature hadn't changed. Who? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer, was afraid of what his next words would be. Chief Detective Robert Lawrence, Marcus said. Your former partner. Your best friend. The man you had a falling out with about 3 months before the accident happened. My mind went blank. Robert Lawrence. I hadn't thought about Robert in almost 20 years. After the accident, after everything fell apart, he'd been strangely absent. He'd come to the funeral, yes, but he'd kept his distance. And shortly after everything was settled, he'd been transferred to a department in California. Last I'd heard, he'd retired early, had moved somewhere back east, had essentially disappeared from my life. But we'd been close once, had been partners in every sense that mattered, had worked together for 15 years before the situation that had ended our friendship. Tell me, I said. It took me a long time to understand the full picture, Marcus said, and I'm still figuring out parts of it. But here's what I know for certain now. You had a reputation at the police department as someone who was starting to ask questions about how things were being handled. There were cases that weren't being investigated properly. There were patterns of evidence being lost or mishandled, and Robert was involved in some of that. At least, that's what you suspected. I never proved anything, I said. I was just noticing inconsistencies. I was considering making a formal complaint. Robert knew you were considering it, Marcus continued, and he was worried. He was worried about what would happen if the investigation went too far, if they started looking into the cases he'd handled, the evidence procedures he'd overseen. He was worried about losing his job and his pension and his reputation. So he was doing things to discredit you, to make you look unstable and unreliable. He was spreading rumors. He was making sure that when you did try to raise your concerns formally, people had already been primed to dismiss you as someone who was losing his grip on reality. The thing at the department, I said slowly, remembering a conversation that had happened 20 years ago, remembering standing in Captain Johnson's office and being told that my concerns about certain procedures were unsubstantiated and that I was being transferred to a different division as a result. That wasn't a normal administrative decision, was it? No, Marcus said quietly. Robert was working with your captain to make sure you were isolated and pushed out. That's what I've learned over the past 20 years. But here's where it gets worse. Here's where it becomes about me specifically. I wasn't sure I was ready to hear what came next, but I also knew that I didn't have a choice. The knowledge was coming, and it was going to change everything about how I understood the past 2 decades of my life. Patricia Morris was investigating the identification error, Marcus said. She was doing it officially because it was a significant mistake that needed to be understood and prevented from happening again. But she was also doing it for personal reasons. Robert Lawrence had been inappropriate with her. He'd made advances that were unwelcome, and she'd reported him to his superiors. Robert had made her look like a troublemaker, had suggested that she was unstable and trying to get revenge for a personal grudge. She almost lost her job over it. So when she discovered that Robert had actively worked to keep the identification error in place, that he'd seen the discrepancies in the dental records, and had signed off on the identification as correct anyway, she understood what was happening. He was keeping me dead because if I came back to life, if the case was reopened, if all the procedural failures came under scrutiny, it would lead directly back to him and his corruption. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out through the gap in the curtains at the parking lot below, at the world continuing on in its ordinary ways while mine was being reconstructed around me. Why didn't Patricia expose this? I asked. Why didn't she go public? Because Robert had more power than she did, Marcus said. Because she knew that if she exposed the corruption, he would retaliate, would make sure she never worked in law enforcement again. He had friends. He had people who owed him favors. And there was another factor. Patricia was afraid that if she exposed Robert, and if the identification error came to light, it would devastate you and my mother. You were already suffering enough. The grief was already destroying you. She made a calculation that protecting my secret, keeping me dead, was the most compassionate thing she could do. That wasn't her choice to make, I said, my voice rough with anger and hurt and confusion. No, Marcus agreed. It wasn't, and she's realized that now. That's actually why I'm here, why I'm breaking 20 years of silence. Patricia has terminal cancer. She's got maybe 6 months left, and she wants to set things right before she dies. She's been tracking me down for the past year, and she convinced me that you deserve to know the truth. That I deserve to have a father again, even if it means reopening old wounds and old investigations. She said that the statute of limitations on some of the things Robert did might have passed, but the corruption itself, the systematic pattern of evidence mishandling, that should still be prosecutable under certain circumstances. How did she find you? I asked. If you've been alive all this time, where have you been? Why are you just appearing now, after 20 years? Marcus took a deep breath. That's a complicated story too, he said. After I recovered from the physical injuries enough to leave the hospital, I was essentially alone in the world. My parents, you and my mother, were grieving the wrong person. Robert's corruption meant that I couldn't just come back to life without potentially destroying evidence and compromising an investigation that Patricia was quietly conducting. So I disappeared. I changed my name. I lived in various cities, took temporary jobs, tried to build a life that was off the books. For a long time, I was trying to figure out who I was without the identity that everyone had given me at birth. I was trying to understand how to exist as someone who had been dead and wasn't. Are you using another name now? I asked. I've used several, he said. The one I've used most consistently for the past decade is James Mitchell. That's the name on my current identification, my current lease, everything. But I'm still Marcus, too. I'm still your son. I've just spent 20 years trying to reconcile those two identities. The sun had completely set outside now, and the parking lot was illuminated by the sodium vapor lights that surrounded the motel. The light coming through the gap in the curtains had turned from orange to gray to nearly black. I realized that I'd been standing by the window for a long time and that my legs felt unsteady. I need to sit down, I said, and I sat back on the edge of the bed. I need to understand this. When did you figure out who you were? When did you start to recover your memories? It took months, Marcus said. The amnesia was the result of significant trauma to my brain. The doctor said that it might never fully resolve. But about 5 months after the accident, things started coming back. I remembered my name. I remembered my mother's face. I remembered you. I remembered the fight we'd had before I took the car, and I remembered being angry with you about something that now seems completely trivial. And once those memories started returning, the floodgates opened. I remembered everything. But you didn't come home, I said, and I heard the pain in my own voice, the accusation and the hurt. I couldn't, Marcus said, and his voice was breaking now, was cracking under the weight of what he was saying. Because by that time, I understood what had happened. Patricia told me everything she'd discovered. She showed me the inconsistencies in the evidence, the way Robert had signed off on the identification error. She told me that if I came back, if I went home, the whole case would collapse and Robert would escape without real justice. Patricia was building something, a careful investigation into the systematic corruption in the department. She was trying to gather evidence quietly to understand the full scope of what Robert and his associates had been doing. She told me that if I appeared alive, it would jeopardize everything she was trying to accomplish. So you stayed away, I said. For 20 years you stayed away because a detective told you to. Not just because she told me to, Marcus said. Also because I wasn't sure that I wanted to go back. I had been dead for months. I had been buried. My grave existed. My funeral had happened. The life I had lived as Marcus was essentially over. And the person I was becoming, James, the survivor, the ghost, that person had a different relationship with the world. I was paralyzed for a long time, remember? I couldn't walk. The doctor said I might never have full mobility again. I didn't know if I wanted to come back to the world in that condition, if I wanted to burden my family with the complications of my existence. He stood up and walked to the other side of the small room, and for the first time, I noticed that he was walking with a slight limp, a favoring of his left leg that was barely noticeable but was definitely there. It took years of physical therapy to get to where I can walk now without crutches or a cane. Years of recovery, and I'm still not normal. I've never been fully back to normal. There are still days when the pain in my left leg is so intense that I can barely function. But I got stronger, I got independent. I became someone else, James, and in many ways I like that person better than the angry, confused boy that Marcus had been. But Patricia, I said, trying to make sense of the timeline, Patricia spent all these years investigating Robert? Not the whole time, Marcus said. At first, yes, she was very focused. But then Robert moved to California, and then he retired. It became harder for her to access information about what he'd done, harder to build a case. She was also constrained by the fact that officially I was dead. She couldn't use me as a witness because I didn't exist in the legal sense. She had to work with the information that was available to her within the department, trying to find paper trails of corruption, trying to connect the dots. It took her a long time to put together enough evidence to make a credible accusation. Why didn't you help her? I asked. Why didn't you come forward as a witness? Because Robert would have killed me, Marcus said simply. I don't say that as a figure of speech or as hyperbole. Robert has demonstrated that he's willing to corrupt evidence to protect himself. Robert has demonstrated that he's willing to let innocent people suffer if it protects his interests. Do you really think he would hesitate to hurt me if I became a threat to him? I understood then, understood in a way that went beyond intellectual comprehension, that everything I'd believed about my life for the past 20 years had been a lie. The version of events that I'd accepted, the narrative that I'd constructed to make sense of the inexplicable, was false. My son wasn't dead. My son had been alive all this time, living under an assumed name, unable to contact me or his mother because there were forces at work that preferred him to stay buried. What about my marriage? I asked, and the question came out small and broken. Your mother and I, we couldn't survive the loss. We couldn't survive what happened. It destroyed us. She left me 5 years after you died. She said she couldn't live with the ghost of you anymore. She said everything in the house reminded her of you and she couldn't bear it. I thought she meant grief. I thought she meant that we were both drowning in it. But maybe what she really meant was that she couldn't live with the lie. I didn't know that, Marcus said quietly. Patricia kept me informed about the big things, but she also tried to shield me from the details of how my death had devastated you and Mom. She said it was better that way, better that I didn't have to know. I was angry at her for a long time because of that, because I felt like she was making decisions for me, deciding what I should know and what I shouldn't know. But I've come to understand that she was doing the best she could in an impossible situation. I stood up and walked across the room to where Marcus was standing. He was still my son. There was no doubt about that. No way to deny it even if I'd wanted to, but he was also a stranger. There were 20 years of life behind his eyes that I knew nothing about. 20 years of experiences that I hadn't been part of. The anger I felt was enormous and misdirected and without a clear target. Robert had done this. Patricia Morris had done this. I had done this, in some ways, by being the kind of person that Robert had wanted to destroy. But Marcus had done it too, by staying away, by letting me grieve for a ghost. I don't know how to feel right now, I said. I don't know if I'm supposed to be angry or grateful or happy or devastated. All of those things, Marcus said. I think you're supposed to feel all of those things at once. I've spent 20 years feeling all of those things at once. We stood there in the small motel room, separated by years and lies and the complicated geography of betrayal and survival. Outside, the parking lot was quiet. The world continued on in its ordinary way, indifferent to the fact that something extraordinary was happening in room 247 of a rundown motel off Highway 30. Is Patricia still alive? I asked. As far as I know, Marcus said. But she doesn't have much time left. Her cancer is advanced. She started chemotherapy, but it's not doing much good. She wanted to meet with you, to explain everything in her own words, to apologize for the choices she made. I've got her contact information. She's living in a care facility in Seattle now. And Robert? I asked. What about Robert Lawrence? Marcus hesitated. That's where this gets complicated again, he said. Robert is living in Boston now. He's retired, living quietly, collecting his pension. Patricia managed to gather evidence of his corruption, but as the years went on, the statutes of limitation started to expire. The cases he mishandled are no longer prosecutable. The evidence he fabricated or destroyed, those crimes are beyond the reach of the law in most cases. Patricia was hoping that if she could prove a pattern of corruption, if she could get you to corroborate her findings with your testimony, they might be able to build a case for some of it. But she's running out of time. She wanted to do this while she was still alive, still able to explain the full context and the full scope of what Robert did. You want me to get involved, I said. It wasn't a question. Patricia wants you to be involved, Marcus said. I want you to decide what you want. I want you to know that there's no right answer here. You could ignore this. You could choose not to cooperate with any investigation. You could choose to protect your own peace and quiet. No one would blame you. You've suffered enough because of Robert's actions. But if I don't do anything, I said, he gets to keep his pension, his freedom, his life, while you've spent 20 years as a ghost and your mother has spent 20 years in grief that might have been preventable. Yes, Marcus said. That's the calculus. But I also understand that there might be a cost to you too. Reopening this investigation might expose other things. It might reveal that there were other victims, other cases that were mishandled. It might drag your name into things in ways that are uncomfortable or painful. I walked back to the window and looked out at the parking lot. I could see my car from where I stood, a gray Honda Accord that I'd bought 3 years ago, and that represented the sum total of my current transportation needs. It looked small and ordinary and insignificant against the backdrop of the motel and the highway and the vast indifference of the night. I need time to process this, I said. I need to think about what you're asking of me, what this means. I know, Marcus said, and I'm not going anywhere. Patricia arranged for me to stay here for a while. We have time to figure this out, to decide what to do next. I turned back to look at my son, and I saw in his face something of the boy I'd lost and something entirely new, something that had been forged through years of isolation and survival and the complicated process of learning how to exist when everyone thought you were dead. I need to tell someone, I said. I need to tell your mother. She needs to know that you're alive. She needs to have the choice of seeing you, of being part of this decision. I know, Marcus said. I want to see her too. I'm terrified, but I want to. I haven't seen her since I was 17 years old. I've spent 20 years imagining what she looks like now, what she's become, whether she would even want to see me. She's going to be angry, I said. She's going to be angry at all of us for letting this happen, for letting her grieve for 20 years when she didn't need to. I know, Marcus said. I'm prepared for that anger. I'm prepared for the fact that she might not forgive me for staying away. I told Marcus that I would contact him the next day once I'd had time to digest what had happened, once I'd had time to tell his mother and understand her reaction. I drove home in silence, the radio off, just the sound of the engine and the rhythmic hum of the wheels on the pavement. My mind was trying to process what I'd learned, trying to reconstruct the past 20 years according to this new information, trying to understand how everything could have been so fundamentally different from what I'd believed. The house was dark when I arrived, but that wasn't unusual. I lived alone now, had lived alone for over a decade, and the darkness was simply the state of things when no one was home to turn on the lights. I turned on the kitchen light and sat at that same round oak table where I'd sat earlier in the day, and I didn't move for several hours. My ex-wife's name was Sarah. She'd remarried about 12 years ago and was living in California now, in San Diego, with a man named Michael who worked in tech and who I'd never met. I had her current phone number, though I rarely used it. We maintained a cordial distance, an agreement that the past was best left unexamined. But this was too important to handle over text or email. This was something that required a real conversation. I called her at 7 in the morning, calculating that in California it would be 6, which was early but not so early that it was unreasonable. She answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. When she heard who it was, the grogginess faded, replaced by a wariness that I recognized. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. "Is someone hurt? Is something wrong?" "Everyone is fine," I said. "Everyone is physically fine. But I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen for a while without interrupting." I told her everything. I started at the beginning with the phone call I'd received, and I continued all the way through to my conversation with Marcus in the motel room. I told her about the identification error, about Robert's corruption, about Patricia Morris's secret investigation. I told her that our son had been alive all this time, living under an assumed name, unable to return to us because of circumstances that were beyond anyone's control. There was a long silence on the line when I finished. I could hear her breathing, could hear her processing what I'd told her. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that Marcus is alive, that he's been alive all this time." "Yes," I said. "Why?" she asked, and the word carried so much pain that I could feel it through the phone. "Why? If he's been alive, why didn't he come home? Why didn't he contact us? How could he let us suffer like this?" I explained about the detective's investigation, about the fear that Robert would retaliate, about the decision to keep Marcus dead to protect the integrity of the case. I explained about his injuries, about the paralysis and the physical therapy and the complicated process of learning to exist as someone else. I gave her all the context and all the reasoning, and I knew even as I was doing it that none of it would be enough, that no explanation would be sufficient to justify 20 years of absence. "I need to see him," Sarah said finally. "I don't care about the investigation or Robert or any of it. I need to see my son. I need to see him with my own eyes to believe that this is real. I can give you his contact information," I said. "He's staying at the Riverside Motel in Portland, room 247. He's going by the name James Mitchell now, but he's been using that name for years. It's the legal name on his identification. I'll be there tomorrow," Sarah said. "I'll fly up to Portland and I'll go to that motel and I will see my son. I will hug him. I will figure out the rest later." She hung up before I could respond, and I was left in my kitchen with the phone in my hand and the knowledge that everything had changed in the span of a few hours. My ex-wife had just committed to flying across the country to meet our dead son. Our life, which had settled into a kind of uncomfortable routine, had been disrupted completely and irrevocably. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my kitchen and I did what I've done so many times over the past 20 years. I replayed the past, searching for moments where things could have gone differently. I thought about the fight I'd had with Robert about his procedures, about the moment when I'd started to suspect that something was wrong. I thought about the decision not to push the complaint through the formal channels. I thought about the car accident and the moment when Marcus's life had pivoted from one trajectory to another. I thought about Patricia Morris making the decision to keep my son dead, to protect her investigation, to let me grieve for nothing. By the time the sun came up the next morning, I had made my own decision. I decided that I would cooperate with Patricia's investigation, that I would help in whatever way I could to expose Robert's corruption, to make sure that what had happened to us didn't happen to anyone else. I decided that Marcus deserved to have his life back, and if that meant dragging my own name through an investigation and reopening wounds that I'd spent 20 years trying to ignore, then so be it. I also decided that I needed to see Robert Lawrence myself, that I needed to understand his perspective on what he'd done and why he'd done it. I didn't know if he would be willing to see me, didn't know if he was even aware of the fact that Marcus was alive, but I decided that I needed to try. I called Marcus early that morning, as soon as the sun had fully risen, to let him know that his mother was coming. I could hear the fear in his voice, the uncertainty about whether Sarah would even want to see him. I told him that she'd sounded certain about it, that she was flying in to meet him, that they were going to have a conversation that was long overdue. "I'm coming back to Portland today," Marcus said. "I want to be there when she arrives. I'm not going to hide. I'm not going to pretend I don't exist. Whatever happens next, it happens in the open." "That's brave," I said. "Or it's reckless," Marcus replied. "I guess we'll find out which one it is." My wife had not been entirely honest with me about her emotional state when we'd spoken that morning. When she walked into the Riverside motel room at 3 in the afternoon the next day, I accompanied her to make sure the moment didn't go wrong. Though in what way I could prevent that from happening was unclear, Sarah wasn't calm or composed or ready. She was shaking when she saw Marcus, shaking as if she were experiencing an earthquake that only she could feel. Marcus stood up from where he'd been sitting, and Sarah walked directly to him, and she didn't embrace him, not at first. She stood about 2 feet away and she just looked at him, as if she were trying to verify that he was real, that he wasn't some elaborate hallucination. "I would recognize you anywhere," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have my mouth. You've always had my mouth, and I can see it in your face right now. And it's the same mouth I've been mourning for 20 years. Then she did embrace him, pulled him close, held on to him like she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. She cried, and Marcus cried, and I stood back and gave them space. Gave them the privacy of their reunion while I looked out at the parking lot and thought about all the moments that we'd lost. All the experiences that should have been part of Marcus's life but instead had been lived in isolation and silence. When they finally separated, Sarah sat down on the bed and held Marcus's hands, and she asked him to tell her everything. He did. He told her the same story he'd told me, and she listened with a kind of hungry attention, as if she was trying to absorb every word. To make up for 20 years of not hearing her son's voice, she asked questions. She cried more. She asked about his physical health, about his scars, about the paralysis that he'd recovered from. She asked about his life, about where he'd been and what he'd done and how he'd survived all these years on his own. When they were done talking, Sarah looked at me and asked what I'd decided about the investigation. I told her that I was in. I told her that I was willing to cooperate with Patricia Morris to provide my testimony, to do whatever was necessary to expose Robert's corruption and make sure he faced consequences for what he'd done. "Then we do this," Sarah said. "We do this for Marcus. We do this for all the years we lost. We do this so that when people ask Marcus what his life was like, he doesn't have to tell them that it was lived in hiding, that he was kept secret because someone wanted to protect his reputation." Over the next several weeks, the three of us, Marcus, Sarah, and I, began the process of working with Patricia Morris to reconstruct what had happened 20 years ago. Patricia invited us to meet with her at the care facility where she was living. A quiet place in Seattle with gardens and common areas designed to provide comfort to people in the final stages of their lives. She was much thinner than I remembered her, and her hair had fallen out completely during her chemotherapy. But her mind was sharp, and her determination was undiminished. Patricia explained to us the investigation she'd conducted over the years. She showed us documentation of evidence that had been mishandled, cases where Robert's procedures had violated protocol, instances where he'd signed off on evidence at the same time that the evidence had gone missing. She showed us the paperwork from my son's case, the dental records that didn't match, the DNA results that had been altered. She explained how a medical examiner had been pressured to sign off on an identification that didn't make sense. She explained how Robert had leveraged his position of authority to make sure that no one questioned the results. What I was never able to prove, Patricia said, was Robert's explicit intention. I could demonstrate that he knew the identification was wrong. I could demonstrate that he had the opportunity to correct it and chose not to. But I couldn't establish a clear motive for keeping Marcus dead. For the longest time, I thought it was purely about protecting himself and his corruption from your investigation, David, but I've since realized that there was probably something else going on. She paused, and I could see that what she was about to tell me was something she'd carried alone for a long time. I think Robert was trying to protect someone else, she said quietly. I think there was someone else in the car with Marcus that night, and I don't think it was Tyler Reeves. What do you mean? I asked. I mean, Patricia said, that I've spent the last few years trying to track down Tyler Reeves, and he doesn't exist. Or rather, he exists in the school records as a student who attended Marcus's high school, but there's almost no other documentation of him. No birth certificate, no social security number, no records outside of the school. It's like someone created him as a placeholder and then erased him. That doesn't make sense, Sarah said. Marcus knew Tyler. They were friends. Marcus knew someone he believed to be named Tyler Reeves, Patricia corrected. But I think that person was actually someone else. I think that person was someone important to Robert, and Robert was willing to cover up the truth about the accident to protect that person's identity. Who? Marcus asked, and I could hear the confusion and hurt in his voice. Who was in the car with me? I don't know, Patricia said. That's the one piece of this puzzle that I was never able to solve. But I know that Robert's ex-wife had a son. I know that son was roughly your age. I know that the boy disappeared around the same time as the accident. I know that Robert's ex-wife left the country shortly after and has been living in Europe ever since. Put together, it suggests something, but I can't prove it. Marcus looked at me, and I could see in his face the realization dawning, the recognition that his best friend for those crucial months, before the accident was probably Robert's son, that the boy he'd gone to the motel party with the night he crashed the car was probably Robert's stepson or half-brother or some complicated family relation to the man who was trying to cover up the truth. So Robert covered it up to protect his family, I said. He let my son be buried in place of his own child. He sacrificed an innocent life to protect his own. That's the most likely scenario based on the evidence, Patricia said. But I can't prove it, and I'm running out of time. That's why I need your help, David. That's why I need Marcus to come forward. That's why I'm asking you all to participate in exposing what happened. What are my options? I asked. What can actually be done about this 20 years later? The corruption itself can be addressed, Patricia said. The mishandling of evidence, the alteration of records, the obstruction of justice, those are still serious crimes, even if the original case is too old to prosecute. If we can get enough corroboration, if we can demonstrate a pattern of behavior, we might be able to build a case that survives legal challenge. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but it's possible. And what about Robert? I asked. What happens to him? If we can build a case, he faces charges, Patricia said. At his age, with his health history, a trial could be difficult for him. He would likely spend his remaining years either in prison or under house arrest, depending on what a judge decides. But the more important thing is that the corruption would be exposed, and people would know what he did, and they would understand that those crimes carried consequences. I made the decision then, in that quiet room with my ex-wife and my son and a dying detective, that I would do everything in my power to make that happen. I didn't do it for revenge, though revenge was certainly part of my feelings toward Robert. I did it because he'd stolen something from me. He'd stolen 20 years of my son's life, 20 years of my wife's life, 20 years of my own life. I did it because his corruption had extended beyond just Marcus and my family. He'd probably hurt others too. People who'd never gotten their own investigation, people who'd never gotten their own resolution. "There's something you should know," Patricia said, looking directly at me. Before he retired, Robert did something that suggests he knew that the truth might eventually come out. He created a document, a confession of sorts, though he never signed it and never explicitly admitted to anything. It was written as if it were a hypothetical, a what-if scenario about someone covering up evidence in a case. He left it with a lawyer, with instructions that it was to be delivered to me after his death. But he's been keeping it updated, adding new sections as the years have gone on. I've received copies of the updates through my lawyer's lawyer. It's like he was documenting his own crimes for posterity, creating a record that would explain his actions even as he was denying them publicly. Does the document implicate his son? I asked. It does, Patricia said. Not by name, but the details are specific enough that anyone with knowledge of the case would understand what happened. Robert's son was in the car with Marcus. They hit the bridge. Marcus went through the windshield, but Robert's son was thrown clear and hit the barrier on the other side of the highway. He was killed on impact. Robert discovered him, realized what had happened, and he made a choice. He decided to cover it up, to pretend that his son had never been in the car at all, to let Marcus take the blame for both deaths. "Where is Robert's son buried?" Sarah asked quietly. "That's the thing," Patricia said. "He's not buried anywhere. Robert's son was cremated, and his ashes were spread in the Pacific Ocean. There's no grave, no record, no physical evidence of his existence except for the confusion in the investigation records. So that's what it had been about. That's what Robert had been protecting all these years. Not his job, not his pension, not his reputation, all of those had been secondary concerns. Robert had been protecting the memory of his dead son, trying to ensure that the world would never know that his boy had been killed in a car. Accident in part because of Robert's own parenting failures, in part because of Robert's failure to be a father who could control or guide or protect his child. I could almost understand Robert's actions from that perspective. Almost. But understanding doesn't equal absolution. Understanding doesn't mean that what he did was justified. Patricia passed away 8 weeks later. Sarah and Marcus and I attended her funeral, a small affair at a crematory in Seattle. She'd specifically requested that there be no religious ceremony, that we simply acknowledge that she'd lived and that we were grateful for the time she'd had. Her lawyer read a brief statement about her dedication to justice and her commitment to exposing corruption within the system she'd served. He didn't mention Marcus or Robert or the case that had consumed so much of her life. Patricia had decided that her own memorial wasn't the place for that story. The story would come later when the investigation was complete. With Patricia's death, the investigation into Robert Lawrence became official. I gave my statement to the district attorney in Portland, describing my concerns about Robert's procedures and my suspicions about the reasons behind my own transfer and isolation. Marcus gave his testimony as well, explaining that he had survived the accident and that he had knowledge of the evidence tampering that had kept him legally dead for 20 years. The evidence Patricia had gathered over the years, the altered records, the mishandled documentation, the inconsistencies in the official records, all of it became part of a formal investigation. Lawyers contacted Patricia's legacy documents, and the hypothetical confessions that Robert had been creating for years became central to the case against him. Robert responded to the charges against him in a way that surprised everyone. He didn't deny them. Instead, he issued a statement through his own lawyer admitting that he had made errors in judgment, that he had allowed personal feelings and personal circumstances to override his professional responsibilities, and that he accepted full responsibility for his actions. He agreed to a plea deal that meant he would avoid a lengthy trial and would instead spend the remainder of his life under house arrest with regular monitoring. In exchange, he provided detailed information about the other cases he'd mishandled over the years, information that allowed the department to review decades of evidence and potentially correct years of injustice. The scandal that erupted in the Portland Police Department as a result of this revelation was enormous. Other detectives were questioned about their relationship with Robert and their knowledge of his procedures. Several of them retired rather than face scrutiny. The department itself underwent a complete audit and a restructuring of its evidence handling protocols. Robert Lawrence's name became synonymous with corruption and cover-up, and I imagine that's something he carries with him now, under house arrest in his Boston home, knowing that his entire professional legacy has been reduced to a story of betrayal and failure. As for Marcus, he made the decision to legally reclaim his original identity. He went through the process of petitioning the court to have his death officially overturned, to have his grave reopened and the remains within it properly identified and given a funeral with dignity. The body in the grave, which turned out to be an unidentified male who had been misidentified as Marcus decades earlier, was eventually matched through DNA to another missing persons case, and Marcus's death was officially vacated. He also decided to stay in Portland. He found an apartment in the northeast neighborhood near where I live, and he started going to community college to pursue the education that had been interrupted by the accident. He worked part-time at a coffee shop, and he spent time with Sarah and me, rebuilding the relationships that had been fractured by his years of absence. The reunion was not easy or seamless. There were difficult conversations. There was anger and hurt and disappointment and complicated grief about all the years that had been lost. But there was also something else, a kind of determination to make the present moment count, to not waste the second chance that Patricia's investigation had given us. Sarah and I never remarried, but we grew closer again, united by the experience of having our lives completely transformed by the revelation of Marcus's survival. We started having dinners together, the three of us, and sometimes I would catch Sarah and Marcus laughing at the same joke or sharing a look that suggested they were communicating on a level that didn't require words. It was strange and painful and beautiful all at once. A year into Marcus's return to Portland, I found myself sitting in my kitchen late one night, unable to sleep, thinking about everything that had happened. I realized something important. I realized that if you'd asked me 5 years ago what I wanted most from my life, I probably would have said that I wanted to be left alone, that I wanted to reach retirement without any more upheaval or disappointment or complicated emotions. But I was grateful now that life hadn't cooperated with that desire. I was grateful that a dead son had called out of the darkness and pulled me back into engagement with the world. The cost of that engagement was real. My reputation had been re-examined and partially rehabilitated as part of the investigation. People understood now that my initial concerns about Robert had been justified, that I'd been right to question his procedures. But it also meant that I'd been dragged through a public investigation into a department I'd spent 15 years serving. It meant that people knew about my family's tragedy in a different way than they had before, more intimately and more completely. But the benefits outweighed the costs, I came to believe. I had my son back. I had my relationship with Sarah restored to something that resembled friendship and cooperation. I had the knowledge that justice, however imperfect, had been served. In the second year after Marcus's return, something else happened. Another detective came forward with information about a cold case that Robert had handled. This detective had always been suspicious about the resolution of the case. And now, with Robert's admission of guilt and his cooperation in the investigation, it was possible to reopen it. That case eventually led to another investigation into cases that other detectives had mishandled. One thing led to another, and suddenly the Portland Police Department was in the midst of a complete reevaluation of its procedures and its past decisions. Some of those cold cases were solved. Some of them led to the exoneration of innocent people who'd been imprisoned based on evidence that had been mishandled or fabricated. Some of them brought closure to families who'd been waiting decades for answers. And some of them, the ones that couldn't be solved or reopened or corrected, at least had the dignity of official acknowledgement that something had gone wrong, that the system had failed them. It was through that process that I came to understand the full scope of Robert's corruption. It wasn't just about covering up what happened to Marcus and his own son. It was about a systematic pattern of behavior that had persisted throughout Robert's entire career. He'd mishandled evidence in assault cases. He'd fabricated witness statements in murder investigations. He'd made procedural errors in drug cases that had resulted in innocent people being convicted. The more the department looked into his work, the more errors they found, the more lives they realized had been negatively affected by his decisions. And the entire reason that this investigation had been allowed to continue, the reason that people had paid attention to the old crimes and the systematic failures, was because a dead man had called his father from a phone number that shouldn't have existed. If Marcus had continued to stay silent, if he hadn't been convinced by Patricia Morris to come forward, if he hadn't made that phone call on a Tuesday in late September, none of this would have happened. Robert would have lived out his remaining years collecting his pension and living quietly in Boston, and the hundreds of people he'd hurt through his corruption would never have known why their cases had failed or why the system had let them down. Is that the moral of this story? Is the point that speaking out matters, that truth-telling has consequences, that silence and hiding are ultimately more dangerous than exposure? I think it is, at least partially. But I also think the story is more complicated than that simple message, because the decision to come forward was also costly. It meant that I had to relive my son's death and understand that it had been built on a foundation of lies. It meant that my ex-wife had to process 20 years of unnecessary grief. It meant that Marcus had to give up his private life and become part of a public narrative about corruption and injustice. Sometimes I think about Robert Lawrence sitting in his house under house arrest, knowing that his name will forever be associated with corruption and failure. And I wonder if he regrets the choices he made. I wonder if he thinks about Marcus and my family and all the lives his actions affected. I wonder if he understands the scope of the harm he caused in trying to protect his son's memory. Because Robert was also a victim of this story, in a way. He was a man who'd made an impossible choice and who'd been forced to live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of his life. But my sympathy for Robert is limited. His son was dead. That was a tragedy, an accident, something beyond anyone's control. The decision he made afterward, the decision to cover it up and let my son be blamed for it, that was his choice. That was something he did, not something that was done to him. And because of that choice, he hurt people. He hurt me. He hurt Sarah. He hurt Marcus. He hurt countless other people whose cases he mishandled as he tried to build a system of corruption that would protect him from scrutiny. In the third year after Marcus's return, I retired from the job that I'd been working since I was forced out of the police department. I'd spent all those years in various positions in security and law enforcement, never quite finding my place, never quite settling into a career that felt right. Retirement gave me the opportunity to think about what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, to figure out if there was something meaningful I could do with the experience and the pain and the complicated knowledge that had been granted to me through the experience of Marcus's return and Robert's exposure. I started working with an organization that investigated cold cases and reviewed old police procedures for errors. I used my knowledge of the department and my understanding of how investigations had been conducted to help other people understand what had gone wrong in their own cases. Sometimes I was able to help families find closure. Sometimes I was able to help innocent people be exonerated. And sometimes I had to help people accept that the system had failed them and that no amount of re-examination would be able to correct the error. It was meaningful work, and it gave me a sense of purpose that I hadn't had in a long time. It also gave me a way to make sense of everything that had happened, to transform personal tragedy into something that could potentially help other people avoid similar tragedies. Marcus graduated from community college and transferred to Portland State University, where he studied criminal justice and psychology. He wanted to understand the systems that had failed him and the people who worked within those systems, to understand how good intentions could become twisted into corruption and cover-up. When he finished his undergraduate degree, he was offered a position as a research assistant with my cold case organization, working specifically on cases involving evidence mishandling and procedural errors. Sarah moved back to Portland after her marriage to Michael ended. She said that she'd realized that the life she'd been living in California had been built on an attempt to escape her past, and that having her past returned to her in the form of her son had changed her perspective on what she wanted from her life. She took a job as a counselor at a community mental health center, working with people who were dealing with grief and loss. She said that having survived her own profound grief and having come out the other side, she wanted to help others do the same. The three of us settled into a new version of family that was different from what we'd been before the accident, but that was also genuine and real and built on a foundation of shared experience and shared trauma. We had dinners together. We went to movies. We took walks along the Willamette River and talked about the things we were working on and the things we were learning. We never talked much about the accident itself or about the 20 years of separation, but the awareness of that time was always present, always informing how we related to each other. On the 5th anniversary of Marcus's phone call, we had a small gathering at my house. Sarah came and Marcus came, and we invited Patricia's niece, who had helped us navigate some of the legal procedures in the later stages of the investigation. We made dinner and we drank wine and we told stories about Patricia, about the investigation, about how everything had changed in a single moment when a phone rang with a call that shouldn't have been possible. "I think about that moment all the time," Marcus said at one point, and we all looked at him, waiting for him to continue. "I think about the moment when I decided to make that call. I'd been preparing for it for weeks, rehearsing what I would say, trying to figure out how to explain something that was fundamentally inexplicable. And I remember thinking, just before I made the call, about whether it was the right thing to do. I remember thinking about how making that call would change everything, would pull everyone I cared about into something complicated and painful. And I remember deciding that it didn't matter anymore, that I was tired of being dead, that I wanted to be alive again, even if being alive meant dealing with all of this. "I'm glad you made the call," Sarah said, and she reached over and took Marcus's hand. "I'm glad you're alive. I'm glad we got a chance to have this." "Me too," Marcus said, "but I'm also grateful that it took as long as it did. If I'd come back 10 years earlier, before I'd recovered enough to walk, before I'd spent time figuring out who I was, I don't think I would have been able to handle it. I think I would have fallen apart. I needed to become James before I could become Marcus again. I needed to live a separate life before I could integrate all of this." I understood what he meant. I'd needed time to grieve, to accept, to move on from one version of my life before I could accept another version. If Marcus had reappeared immediately after the accident, if the mistake had been discovered quickly, the reunion would have been fundamentally different. We would have had less time to change, less time to become people who could handle the complicated truth of what had happened. "What I want to know," Sarah said, looking at me, "is whether you've forgiven Robert." It was a question I'd asked myself many times. I'm not sure I have an answer that's entirely true. I've reached a state of acceptance, I think. I understand what Robert did and why he did it. I understand the impossible choice he faced and the way he decided to respond to that impossible choice. I understand that his actions came from a place of love for his son, even though that love was expressed through lies and corruption and the sacrifice of innocent people. But forgiveness implies a kind of erasing of what happened, a kind of moving past it and allowing someone to be free of the consequences of their actions. I don't think that's what I feel. What I feel is more like a complicated compassion mixed with the recognition that Robert has paid a price for what he did. He spent the last 5 years under house arrest, denied his freedom, his reputation destroyed, his entire legacy defined by his corruption. That's not a punishment that I would have chosen for him. I would have chosen something different, something more clearly proportional to the harm he caused. But it's what he's experiencing, and there's something in that outcome that feels like justice, even if it's not complete or entirely satisfying. I don't know if I've forgiven him, I said to Sarah, but I've stopped being angry at him every single day. That's something. In the years that followed, I've tried to be careful about telling this story. There are people who ask me to write a book about what happened, to share my experience with a wider audience, to become in some ways a spokesperson for victims of systemic corruption. I've declined most of those requests because I'm aware that this story isn't just mine. It's Marcus's story, and Sarah's story, and Patricia's story, and even Robert's story in a complicated way. It's the story of all the people who were hurt by Robert's actions and who never got an investigation or an explanation. But I'm telling it now, at least some version of it, because I think there's something important in the narrative that might help someone who's been in a similar situation. I think there's value in understanding that false identification can happen, that evidence can be mishandled, that corruption can hide for decades beneath the surface of institutions that are supposed to protect people. I think there's value in understanding that sometimes the truth comes out unexpectedly, sometimes it takes longer than it should, sometimes the cost of truth-telling is higher than it ought to be. And I think there's value in understanding that even when everything falls apart, even when the life you thought you had is revealed to be built on a foundation of lies, there's still the possibility of reconstruction, of finding new meaning, of building something better from the rubble of what came before. I don't know what the future will bring for me, for Marcus, for Sarah. I don't know if the investigations into the Portland Police Department's procedures will ever be fully complete or if there will be other revelations waiting in the past. I don't know if there will be other cold cases solved through our work or if we found as many solutions as we're going to find. I don't know if Robert Lawrence will spend his entire remaining life under house arrest or if he'll eventually be pardoned and allowed to return to normal life. What I do know is that my son is alive. I know that I can have conversations with him, that I can watch him grow and change and become the person he's meant to be. I know that my relationship with Sarah has been restored to something real and meaningful. I know that we have a second chance at family, even if it looks different from what we expected it to look like. And I know that the phone call came. I know that on a Tuesday in late September, a voice came through the darkness and said, "Dad, it's me. I'm alive." And nothing in my life was ever the same after that moment. Everything was rebuilt. Everything was re-examined. Everything was transformed. If you were in my position, if you'd received that phone call, if you'd learned that everything you believed about a fundamental event in your life was built on a misunderstanding, what would you do? Would you want to know the truth? Or would you want to remain in your comfortable ignorance, in the familiar pain that you've learned to live with? I ask this not as a rhetorical question, but as a genuine curiosity. Because I've learned that there's no right answer. There's only the answer that each person makes for themselves, based on their own values and their own capacity for change and their own willingness to embrace the unknown. The end of this story isn't really an ending. It's more like a pause, a moment where I'm looking back at everything that's happened and trying to make sense of it, trying to understand what it all means. The investigation continues. The work continues. The process of rebuilding continues. And somewhere in Boston, Robert Lawrence sits in his house, probably thinking about his own son, probably replaying the moment when he made the decision that changed everything. This is the story of a phone call that shouldn't have been possible. This is the story of a death that wasn't really a death. This is the story of how corruption and truth and love and loss and justice all intersect in the lives of ordinary people living ordinary lives in ordinary cities. And this is the story of how everything can change in a single moment, how a single phone call can transform your entire understanding of your own life. I share it with you not as a cautionary tale or as a judgment or as an attempt to tell you how to live your own life. I share it as a reflection on the human capacity for survival, on the resilience we all possess even when we don't know we possess it, on the possibility of redemption and reconstruction in the face of overwhelming loss. If you've experienced your own profound loss, if you've faced your own impossible choices, if you've had to live with uncertainty and grief and the burden of secrets, I hope this story offers you something. I hope it offers you hope that the truth can emerge, that justice can be served even when it takes years, that families can be restored even when they've been broken. I hope it offers you the understanding that you're not alone, that these dark places in the human experience are shared by many people, that there's strength in that sharing and in the collective acknowledgement of how complicated life can be. What do you think has happened to Robert Lawrence in the years since the investigation concluded? Do you believe his house arrest is enough punishment for what he did? Would you have made the same choices that he made, or do you think you would have handled the situation differently? If you've lived through something like this yourself, if you've faced a truth that fundamentally changed your understanding of your own life, I want you to know that your story matters too. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. The investigation into Robert Lawrence and the Portland Police Department's systematic corruption continues even now. There are still cold cases being reviewed, still evidence being re-examined, still families waiting for closure, and in some small way, I'm part of that process. In some small way, Marcus's choice to come out of the darkness is still creating ripples, still changing things, still helping other people find their own justice.